Coming up next, Uppin' and Ippin'. Coming up next, Bobby Boy. Coming up next, Zip Zip. Coming up next, Jimmy Two Shoes. Coming up next, the Powerpuff Girls. Coming up next, Dexter's Laboratory. Coming up next, Ben 10. Coming up next, Codename Kids Next Door. Coming up next, Robot Chicken. Coming up next, Ejen Alley. Coming up next, Ejen Alley. Coming up next, Ejen Alley. Coming up next, Chuck's Chicken. Coming up next, Harry and Bunnies. Coming up next, The Fairly Odd Parents. Coming up next, Danny Phantom. Coming up next, Ben 10, The Strange Chores. Coming up next, Codename, Kids Next Door Show. Coming up next, Ben 10, Alien Force. Coming up next, Codename, Kids Next Door. Coming up next, The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy. Coming up next, Summer Camp Island. Coming up next, The Amazing World of Gumball. Coming up next, Elliot from Earth. Coming up next, Wow You Lamb. Coming up next, Alaska. Coming up next, Steven. Coming up next, Frankie. Coming up next, Reggie. Coming up next, Millie. Coming up next, The Mighty Bee. Coming up next, My Life as a Teenage Robot. Coming up next, Star vs. the Forces of Evil. Coming up next, The 7D. Coming up next, The Mighty Squirrel Boy. Coming up next, My Life as a Juniper Lee. Coming up next, Cat Dog. Coming up next, Cat Scratch.